Our next step for making our bodice is to put boning into the seams of the bodice. We only want to place boning in the lining. This boning will help the bodice to stay up, particularly if you are making a strapless dress. So boning is really important if you're doing something that doesn't have anything else to hold the bodice up. So we're going to first start by ironing all of our seams out to make the bodice sit nice and flat, and then I will show you how to put the boning into the lining. You will notice that along the bust seam I've made little snips in the bodice. That's just so that when we push it through to the other side, that can all sort of fold in. It stops it from being too bulky. I'm now going to do the same with the lining, ironing all of the seams outwards. It's a little bit hard for the camera to see because there's no Shapewell, so there's no white on the lining, so I'll just do that quickly, but I'll turn the camera off while I do that. With the lining, along this bust seam, I haven't decided to cut out these little triangles because that's actually going to sit facing outwards, so we're not going to have to push that through to the other side, so we don't need to cut those little triangles in that seam. What we're going to do now is place boning in each of these seams. So I'll show you how to do it on this one, just because it's easier for you to see the seam, but I'm going to be sewing it to this one. So we're going to cut boning for each of the seams on our lining. I've chosen to use boning that is a white 12mm wide one. It doesn't matter really what one you go for, it can be a bit bigger or smaller. This is just the one that I prefer to use. This one doesn't have a fabric casing. We're going to sew this one straight onto the gown. So the first thing you need to do is cut your boning to size. So we want to leave a little gap at the top and the bottom so that when we sew our lining and our skirt to the bodice, we have room to fold that over. So that's our seam allowance. So we want it at least 1.5, maybe a bit more from the edge. So I'll go ahead and cut a piece for each of these seams. You'll notice that I only measured 3 of the seams. That's because the other 3 seams will obviously be exactly the same as their opposite one. So when we're positioning the boning on the bodice, we want the outer seams to sit like that so that the curve is facing down, and we want the bust seam to sit like that so that the curve is facing outwards. Okay, so this one's going out, these ones curving down towards the bodice. We can't really pin these on, so we'll just have to hold them in position as we sew them. Before we sew them, we just want to do one little extra thing, because sometimes these pieces can be a little bit sharp. So what you'll need to do is get a little bit of scrap fabric. I'll show you with some Calico because it's a little bit easier to see, but make sure you do it in the same colour as your lining. So I will use a black one. Just get a little bit of fabric, fold it a couple of times, and then place it over the end of your boning. You can then just stitch that across a few times, and that will hold that in position and stop those edges being too sharp in your dress. You can sew straight through this. It's got little holes in the boning. I don't know if you can see that. Just to focus. but the needle will just slip through those little holes. So we'll sew that on now, and I'll make sure I'm sewing it to the lining, not this bodice. When you're sewing the boning on, you just want to sort of position it about 1.5 from the top. Make sure you've got a big enough gap down the bottom as well. And you just want to sew once down the right hand side and once down the left hand side. I've positioned it over the centre of the seam so that I've got an even amount of boning on both sides. So just position it in the middle and check it underneath as you go along. So here is my bodice finished with all of the boning sewn into each of the seams. I've just tugged on the boning on the side seam and the back seam just to make it a little bit straighter, and I've left the two front seams a little bit more rounded. Now that we've done this, we can start thinking about how we want to decorate our bodice. So I've got my satin bodice here. If you wanted to, you could cover it with some beading, you could put some, maybe even some beaded lace over the top of it. Another idea is to maybe use some chiffon to create some pleats over the top of that. I'll show you how to do that quickly, but that's not what I'm going to do for my bodice. I've already decided that I'm going to create a lace overlay that will go up and over my shoulders. So here I've positioned some chiffon over the top of the bodice. I'm going to show you how to do this by placing chiffon on the other side. Chiffon is quite a see-through fabric, so you would obviously want to have the same colour underneath. I'm only using blue because it's a bit easier to see the creases than if I were to use a black chiffon. So when we're working with the chiffon, we want to work with the bias. If you're not sure what the bias is, you can either look it up on the internet or I'll try to explain it to you now. So we've got the selvage of the fabric, which is this edge here, and then we've got the edge here which has been cut. The bias is running at a diagonal to that. When we work on the bias, the fabric is a little bit more stretchy, so we can get much nicer pleats and it will curve around the body in a much more flattering way than if we were to try and work at a parallel or opposite direction to the selvage. So to start with, what I normally do is I just go to the corner and I just sort of go down a bit and grab a nice bundle. I don't want to work right from the point because there's not going to be enough fabric there. I need quite a big chunk. Normally you would cut all of this excess off, but I'm planning on reusing this fabric, so I'm just going to leave it there. But it would get a little bit annoying because it is heavy and it can drag the fabric down a little bit. So to start with, I'm just going to sort of position it where I want it. I'm going to play around, make sure I'm happy with how it's sitting, and after that I'll start putting pins in. I'm going to place pins along the bottom and along the top and down the side seam. At the moment, I'm just going to pin straight into the mannequin. I'm not going to bother about going through and back out the fabric. So I'm just playing around with how I want it to look. Some people like to do perfectly folded and positioned pleats, but for this one I'm just going to sort of scrunch it up and see where I like it. So we want to cover the entire bodice all the way to the side seam. Don't worry if there's a little bit of a gap here when you're finished, because that's actually going to be in your seam allowance anyway. So that's roughly how I would want my pleats to sit. I haven't quite finished yet. I would probably then just go and refine those pleats and make sure they're sitting perfectly. Another thing you can do is place your pin straight through the middle of the bodice to get your pleats exactly where you want them, and then you would stitch them down by basically flipping the pleat out, grabbing the underneath side of the fabric and going through to the bodice, so that way you wouldn't see any of your stitches. You've got to be really careful and take your time, so it can be quite a lengthy process. What I would do now is go across the top and actually pin through the bodice. You can still go into the mannequin if you want, but actually catching the bodice fabric this time, and just refining everything a little bit and making sure that my pins along the edge actually run in line with my seam allowance. I would also do the same on the bottom, make sure I've got pins all the way along to the side seam, and then I would just baste stitch it where those pins were so that I can take it off and try it on. It's always good to try it on because you might find that the fabric stretches or folds slightly different when it's on your body shape, so you need to make sure those pleats look good on you. Then what you would do is come to the side seam here, and you would actually unpick that side seam. Then you would get whatever leftover fabric you've got here, and you would stitch that with a machine, or you can hand stitch it into the side seam. So before you do that, obviously you would need to cut off any excess. Same on the other side. Then for the back, you would just either place a flat piece of chiffon, or you might want to put pleats on that as well. Stitch it around the edge, obviously keeping it close to the edge so that when you sew your seams you're not going to see those stitches. And then you would obviously, once you've finished that, sew it back so that you've got a full bodice again. With the back, you wouldn't need to do it on a mannequin because it's flat. It doesn't have to curve around a bust or anything, so that's easy enough to place pleats on just flat on a desk and just putting the pins in where you want it. You can iron your pleats so that they stay in position a little bit more, or you can just leave them quite loose and baggy like this. It's up to you. Another way you can do it is to grab the bias, okay, so running at a diagonal to the selvage. You could stitch straight along so that you're creating, do a gathering stitch so that you're creating a bunch of gathers, and then just sort of spread those gathers out all over the bodice. So you could do a gathering stitch along the bottom and just pull the chiffon out over the bodice. You can do it whatever way you like. It's really just a case of playing around and seeing what you like. Again, as I said, you might decide to do perfectly positioned pleats one after the other all the way around. It's just a case of playing and figuring out what you like. After you've sewn the front on, you've sewn the back on, and then you've joined the front and back together again, then you can sew your lining onto your bodice to enclose all of those raw edges. So that's what I'm going to do now, but I'm actually going to take this chiffon off because I'm not actually using chiffon for my final piece. So here's an example of what beaded lace might look like. There's lots of different kinds. This one more so has the pattern down the bottom, and then it sort of spreads out into just smaller pieces up the top. What you could do if you wanted to use this sort of stuff, let's say for example you only wanted the beads on the center of the bodice, you would just sort of cut out the shape that you want, so cutting around the edge of the sort of flowery shapes that it's got here. Get rid of all the other stuff, and then you can basically put little tiny hand stitches all the way around so that it stays in place. Obviously for this type of beaded lace you would use white, so you're just matching the colour of your beaded lace. You would do a small stitch on the front. It can be as big as you want on the back. As you move to the next spot, bring the needle through and do a small stitch. After you've secured it so that it's not going to move at all, you would then get some small, maybe some small scissors or some sort of snips or whatever you've got, and you would get in as close as you can and snip away all of this tulle sort of stuff that is surrounding the beads. That way you're only left with the actual beaded pattern, and it looks like you've actually sewn it on there yourself, but you haven't, so it's a bit of a trick doing it that way. Or you can of course just lay it out and sew it on like that if that's how you want it. So now we're going to join our bodice to our lining. We're only going to join it along the top. You could sew it along the bottom if you want, but we're not going to do that just yet. So what you need to do is have your bodice facing up, so you can see I've got my shapewell and my seams underneath and the good side facing up. And we're going to place the lining over the top with the boning facing up. So we've got our nice sides together. Then what we're going to do is pin all of the seams together, just working along the top. Then we'll pin everything in between so that it's nice and secure all the way along, making sure your edges are together. After we do that, we're going to sew a 1.5 seam allowance all the way across the top. If you find your boning has gone a little bit too close to the top edge of the fabric, you may just need to sew a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So now that I've stitched across the top with a 1.5 seam allowance, I'm going to snip into the point in the centre of the bodice, just so that that folds out a bit evenly, and then I'm going to do what's called a top stitch. For a top stitch, we need to have the bodice and the lining both flattened out. So normally they would sit like that. I've opened it out. So I'll show you on the inside. I've opened it out like that. So you can see that the bodice with the shapewell naturally wants to sit in this direction, and that's good because what we're going to do now is do what's called a top stitch along there, but we're going to be looking from the other side. So we're going to stitch on the other side as close as we can to this thread on the lining side, catching this seam behind. So when I flip it over, I've got my lining, I've got my satin, okay, and I've got my seam in here. So here's where the fabrics have been joined. I'm going to stitch just next to it on the side of the lining, catching that seam that's sitting underneath. I've just tried to lighten it a little bit so that you can see the seam here. Hopefully that will help you a little bit. I'm tugging quite a bit to make sure that this lining doesn't roll over as I'm sewing it. I'm just feeling to make sure my seam is facing this direction. Hopefully you can see the stitch I've done on the lining. Here's where the two fabrics are joined. This is the satin fabric, and I've caught the seam at the back. Now that that's sewn down and we've done our top stitch, we just need to press it so that it stays nice and folded over. So we're just going to go along this top seam here, making sure that the lining is not showing on the front of the bodice, so we want to fold it so that the satin is sort of just poking up out the top, and we're going to iron that all the way along. So the next thing I'm going to do is create my lace overlay for my bodice. So I've decided to use a reasonably thick lace. and that's going to go up over my shoulders and create just a nice sort of pattern to add to the bodice, because other than that it's going to be reasonably plain. So the first thing I need to do is cut out my pattern. This pattern has been provided. It needs to be printed on A3 paper, and then you will need to sticky tape both of the sheets of paper together, so just lining it up. So we'll cut that out, and then I'll position it on my fabric, and I'm going to make a couple of adjustments when I actually cut it out as well. Okay, so now I'm going to cut out my lace to go over the top of my bodice. What I did was I cut out a Calico version of the overlay first, just because I wanted to make sure it would fit nicely. I found it was a little bit short, so I'm going to need to extend it a bit at the bottom, and I've also adjusted the neckline. What I did to adjust the neckline was I just got an item of clothing that sort of sits how I wanted my bodice overlay to sit on my body, and I just laid this over the top of that and compared where the fabric was sitting and just made adjustments to that. So initially I left this big chunk on here, and then I laid it over the top of the other fabric and just cut out this shape in here. Next thing I'm going to do is remove the calico from the lace. Then I'm going to sew what's called a dart in the front of the bodice on both sides. It's folded in half, so we need to sew it on both sides. The way that we sew those darts is by folding the fabric in half and sewing along that line. On the pattern piece that you were given, you have a line there. So when I transfer it, what I like to do is sort of maybe line a ruler along there or something, so that when I flip it up I've got a nice fold. I can draw a line there, do the same on the other side of the dart, draw a line there, and then I can just fold it and stitch it. So I'll show you on the piece of calico how you would fold it and stitch it. So it's really just the case of, first of all, pinching it at the point. You want this to be on the inside of your bodice. So if you've got a good side, make sure you pinch it towards the bad side. Pinning through one side and making sure that pin is showing through the line on the other side. Same thing again, I pin through that line, make sure it comes out on the line on the other side. And then once I've got the crease in the right position, I like to pin it sideways. That. Then I can remove these other flat pins so that I can sew straight down there without having to remove the pins and let the fabric slip around. So what we'll do is we'll sew the darts. After we've sewn the darts, we're going to sew the side seam of the bodice front to the side seam of the bodice back. After we've done that, we will sew the shoulder seams together. Then we should have something that we can try on, make sure it fits, and then what I will do is probably add my neck.